In 1873, the widow Constance Pemberton arrived at Willowbrook Plantation in Lafourche Parish, Louisiana, carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel and a reputation that preceded her like morning fog over the bayou. The previous owner, her late husband Jeremiah Pemberton, had died under circumstances that the local physician described only as sudden and unexplained. What followed in the months after her arrival would challenge everything the scientific community thought they understood about human behavior and the limits of grief. Willowbrook sat on nearly 2,000 acres of fertile delta land, bordered by ancient cypress groves and connected to the main road by a single dirt path that wound through the marsh for 3 miles. The plantation house itself was a testament to antebellum excess, 3 stories of white columns and wraparound galleries built in 1847 when cotton prices soared and labor was abundant. By the time Constance arrived, however, the war had transformed the landscape. The fields lay fallow, the slave quarters stood empty, and the great house echoed with the footsteps of just one woman and her elderly housekeeper. Margaret Thibodeau, a local woman in her 60s who had worked at Willowbrook since before the war, would later describe those first weeks to a parish official. According to her testimony, archived in the Lafourche parish records, Constance spent entire days walking the empty halls, pausing at doorways as if listening for voices that never came. The widow was 37 years old, tall and angular, with dark hair that she wore severely pulled back and grey eyes that seemed to focus on something beyond whatever stood in front of her. The plantation records show that Constance made no attempt to restore agricultural operations or hire new workers. Instead, she devoted her attention to what Margaret described as endless correspondence with parties unknown. Letters arrived weekly via the postal rider from Thibodeau, and Constance would retreat to the plantation office for hours, writing responses that Margaret was instructed to burn immediately after they were sent. When asked about the contents of these letters during later questioning, Margaret claimed ignorance, stating only that her employer had forbidden her from entering the office and that the smell of burning paper was constant during those first months. The local community initially regarded Constance with the mixture of sympathy and curiosity typically reserved for wealthy widows. The plantation had been a significant employer before the war, and many families in the parish had connections to Willowbrook spanning generations. However, this neighborly concern began to shift in late autumn when Father Antoine Boudreau of St. Joseph Catholic Church noted that Constance had not attended a single service since her arrival. More troubling, she had declined all invitations to social gatherings and had turned away visitors without explanation. Dr. Edmund Rousseau, the parish physician who had attended Jeremiah Pemberton during his final illness, attempted to call on Constance in October of that year. His notes, preserved in the Rousseau family papers and donated to the Louisiana Historical Society in 1962, describe an encounter that left him deeply unsettled. According to his account, when he approached the front door of the plantation house, he found it standing open despite the cool weather. Margaret met him on the gallery and explained that Mrs. Pemberton was indisposed, but that she was not ill in any conventional sense. When Dr. Rousseau pressed for details, Margaret's composure cracked. She admitted that her employer had taken to speaking with empty rooms, as if they were occupied, and that she had witnessed Constance setting places at the dining table for guests who never arrived. Most disturbing, Margaret reported that Constance had begun referring to herself in the plural, using phrases like, "we have decided," and "our plans require," when discussing household matters. Dr. Rousseau requested permission to examine Constance, but Margaret refused, stating that her employer had given explicit instructions that no medical professionals were to be admitted to the house under any circumstances. The isolation of Willowbrook and the widow's increasingly erratic behavior might have remained a local curiosity had it not been for the discovery made by young Thomas Landry in December of 1873. Thomas, the 16-year-old son of a neighboring farmer, had been hunting rabbits in the cypress grove that bordered the plantation when he noticed something unusual near an old dependency building that had once served as a storehouse. According to his later testimony to the parish sheriff, he found evidence of recent excavation. Several areas where the earth had been disturbed and then carefully smoothed over, marked only by the absence of fallen leaves that covered the surrounding ground. Thomas reported his findings to his father, who in turn contacted Sheriff Auguste Boudreau. The sheriff's investigation, documented in reports that were transferred to the Louisiana State Archives in 1959, revealed a pattern of nocturnal activity at Willowbrook that defied explanation. Interviews with residents whose properties bordered the plantation revealed that lights had been seen moving through the fields and outbuildings during the early morning hours, always between midnight and dawn. Several witnesses reported the sound of digging, though none had investigated personally due to the isolation of the location and growing rumors about the widow's mental state. Sheriff Boudreau's initial visit to Willowbrook on December 18, 1873, was documented in his official report. He found Constance Pemberton to be articulate and composed, though he noted several details that struck him as unusual. The parlor where she received him contained numerous chairs, arranged in a conversational circle. Despite her claim that she entertained no visitors, more puzzling, she referred repeatedly to our household and our responsibilities, even though Margaret confirmed that only the two women resided at the plantation. When questioned about the excavations discovered on her property, Constance's explanation was both plausible and unsettling. She claimed to be conducting agricultural experiments in preparation for the eventual restoration of cotton cultivation. She produced sketches and notes that seemed to support this explanation, showing detailed plans for soil improvement and drainage systems. However, Sheriff Boudreau noted that the excavations bore no resemblance to the agricultural improvements described in her documentation. They were too small, too scattered, and too carefully concealed to serve any practical farming purpose. The sheriff's report also documented his conversation with Margaret Thibodeau, who had served as housekeeper at Willowbrook for over 20 years. Margaret's account introduced elements that would later prove central to understanding the events at the plantation. According to her testimony, Constance had arrived with several large trunks in addition to her personal belongings. These trunks, which Margaret estimated to number at least 6, had been stored in the plantation office and were never opened in her presence. More significantly, Margaret reported that Constance possessed an extensive collection of medical and scientific texts, many of which appeared to deal with subjects far removed from typical feminine interests of the era. Margaret's description of daily life at Willowbrook painted a picture of increasing strangeness. Constance maintained regular hours, rising before dawn and retiring precisely at 10 in the evening. However, her activities during the day followed no pattern that Margaret could understand. She would disappear for hours into the office, or venture into the fields, carrying tools and supplies whose purpose Margaret could not determine. Most disturbing, Constance had established what she called consultation hours each afternoon between 3 and 5, during which she would sit in the parlor and conduct conversations with empty chairs, often taking notes as if receiving important information. The widow's correspondence also troubled Margaret deeply. Letters continued to arrive weekly, but Constance's responses grew increasingly lengthy and urgent. Margaret reported finding her employer writing by candlelight well past midnight, surrounded by medical texts and what appeared to be scientific diagrams. When questioned about the recipients of these letters, Constance would only say that she was collaborating on research of vital importance and that the work could not be delayed. Winter deepened around Willowbrook, and with it came reports that would transform local curiosity into genuine fear. In January of 1874, several residents of nearby farms reported seeing figures moving through the plantation fields during snowfall, their movements leaving no tracks in the pristine white coverage. These sightings always occurred during the darkest hours before dawn, and witnesses described seeing multiple individuals despite the knowledge that only Constance and Margaret lived at the plantation. Dr. Rousseau, increasingly concerned about both the widow's mental state and the growing unease in the community, attempted a second visit in February. His notes from this encounter, more detailed than his previous account, describe a woman transformed. Constance received him in the parlor, but her appearance had changed dramatically. She had lost considerable weight, her grey eyes appeared sunken, and her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea from a service set for 4 people. Most unsettling, she addressed empty chairs during their conversation, pausing as if listening to responses before continuing. When Dr. Rousseau gently suggested that she might benefit from rest and possibly a change of scenery, Constance's reaction was immediate and fierce. She insisted that her work at Willowbrook was far too important to abandon, and that she had obligations that prevented any consideration of departure. She spoke of subjects that required her constant attention and experiments that were reaching crucial stages. When pressed for details, she became evasive, stating only that her research had applications that would revolutionize understanding of human behavior and that she was corresponding with like-minded investigators across the country. Dr. Rousseau's notes include a disturbing detail that he struggled to interpret. During their conversation, Constance excused herself briefly to retrieve a volume from the office. In her absence, he heard what sounded like multiple voices coming from the upper floors of the house, engaged in what appeared to be animated discussion. When he mentioned this to Margaret later, the housekeeper's face went pale, and she admitted that she had been hearing similar sounds for weeks. She had assumed that Constance was reading aloud to herself, but the voices seemed too distinct and varied for a single person to produce. The most troubling aspect of Dr. Rousseau's visit was Constance's casual reference to her deceased husband, as if he were still present. She spoke of Jeremiah's preferences regarding household matters and mentioned that he had been most helpful in her recent research. When Dr. Rousseau gently reminded her of her widowed status, Constance paused for a long moment, then smiled and said that death was a temporary inconvenience, that her studies were helping her to better understand. Spring arrived early in Louisiana that year, and with it came the discovery that would finally bring outside attention to Willowbrook Plantation. In March of 1874, a group of parish officials conducting routine property assessments for tax purposes approached the plantation and made observations that prompted immediate action by local authorities. Led by tax assessor Henri Boudreau, the group noted several disturbing features: the complete absence of livestock or agricultural activity despite Constance's claims of farming operations, the presence of what appeared to be chemical odors emanating from the outbuildings, and most significantly, evidence of extensive excavation throughout the property that had been carefully concealed with new vegetation. Henri Boudreau's official report, filed with the parish clerk on March 23, 1874, documented systematic evidence of covert activity at Willowbrook. The assessment team had discovered at least 12 distinct excavation sites, ranging in size from small plots barely large enough for a single person to areas that could accommodate multiple individuals. Each site showed signs of regular maintenance, with the soil kept loose and marked with small stones arranged in patterns that suggested some form of organizational system. More disturbing was the condition of the plantation's outbuildings. Several structures that had once served agricultural purposes showed signs of recent modification, Windows had been covered with heavy cloth, new locks had been installed on doors, and ventilation systems had been constructed that seemed designed to contain rather than circulate air. The chemical odors noted by the assessment team were strongest near these modified buildings, though none of the officials could identify the specific substances responsible for the smell. Sheriff Boudreau, accompanied by Dr. Rousseau and Father Antoine, returned to Willowbrook on March 28th for what they intended to be a formal welfare check on Constance Pemberton. Their arrival at the plantation house revealed immediate evidence that something significant had occurred in the preceding days. The front door stood open, creaking gently in the spring breeze, and the interior of the house showed signs of hasty departure. Drawers pulled open, papers scattered across floors, and furniture overturned in several rooms. Margaret Thibodeau was found in the kitchen, sitting at the wooden table with her hands folded in her lap. Her mental state, according to Sheriff Boudreau's report, appeared severely compromised. When questioned about Constance's whereabouts, Margaret could only repeat that they had finished the work, and that everyone had gone to their proper places. She seemed unable to distinguish between past and present events, referring to people and activities as if they were happening simultaneously across multiple time periods. Dr. Rousseau's examination of Margaret revealed physical evidence consistent with prolonged stress and malnutrition. But more concerning was her apparent disconnection from reality. She spoke of conversations with individuals who were demonstrably not present, and she insisted that the plantation was fully occupied by residents who were simply resting during the day. When pressed for details about Constance's activities, Margaret's accounts became increasingly fantastical, involving references to scientific equipment, medical procedures, and collaborations with researchers from distant universities. The search of the plantation house conducted by Sheriff Boudreau and his deputies revealed extensive evidence of activities that defied conventional explanation. The office where Constance had conducted her correspondence contained hundreds of letters, scientific journals, medical texts, and detailed diagrams that appeared to document systematic experiments in human behavior modification. Many of the letters were addressed to medical professionals in cities across the United States, and their contents suggested research collaboration on subjects that contemporary science considered highly theoretical. Among the most disturbing discoveries were detailed records of what Constance termed behavioral observations, documenting changes in speech patterns, physical responses, and psychological states among subjects identified only by numerical designations. These records spanned several months and suggested systematic experimentation with techniques designed to influence human consciousness and perception. References to environmental controls, sensory modification, and compliance reinforcement appeared throughout the documentation, though the specific methods employed remained unclear from the written records alone. The modified outbuildings yielded evidence that transformed the investigation from a welfare check into a criminal inquiry. Inside the largest structure, formerly a cotton storage barn, Sheriff Boudreau discovered what could only be described as a makeshift laboratory. Tables bearing chemical equipment, restraining devices of unusual design, and containers holding substances that Dr. Rousseau could not immediately identify filled the space. Most disturbing were detailed anatomical charts covering the walls, annotated with handwritten notes in Constance's precise script that documented what appeared to be systematic observations of human subjects under various forms of stress. The excavation sites discovered throughout the property were systematically investigated over the following weeks. Each revealed evidence of recent use, though the specific purposes remained unclear. Some contained the remains of small structures that appeared to have been living quarters. while others showed evidence of having been used for storage or disposal of materials related to Constance's research. The careful organization and maintenance of these sites suggested long-term planning and systematic implementation of activities that had been conducted over many months. Most significantly, the investigation revealed evidence of multiple individuals who had been present at Willowbrook, despite official records indicating that only Constance and Margaret resided there. Personal items, clothing of various sizes, and improvised sleeping arrangements in the modified outbuildings suggested that the plantation had housed a larger population than anyone had realized. However, the identities and current whereabouts of these additional residents remained a complete mystery. The correspondence discovered in Constance's office provided crucial insight into the scope and nature of her activities. Letters from medical professionals in New Orleans, Atlanta, and Richmond revealed that she had been conducting research in collaboration with individuals who shared her interest in what she termed behavioral modification and consciousness control. The letters discussed theories about human perception, memory formation, and the possibility of creating what one correspondent described as compliant subjects for therapeutic intervention. Dr. Rousseau's analysis of the medical and scientific texts found at Willowbrook revealed that Constance possessed knowledge far beyond what would be expected of a plantation widow. Her collection included recent publications on neurology, psychology, and emerging theories about human consciousness. Marginal notes in her handwriting demonstrated sophisticated understanding of complex medical concepts and suggested that she had been conducting experiments designed to test theoretical approaches to influencing human behavior. The official investigation into events at Willowbrook Plantation was concluded in June of 1874 with the filing of Sheriff Boudreaux's final report. The document, archived with the Louisiana State Police and transferred to the State Archives in 1958, presents a case that defied conventional resolution. Constance Pemberton had disappeared without trace, leaving behind evidence of activities that suggested systematic experimentation on human subjects. Yet no victims had been identified, and no crimes could be definitively established. Margaret Thibodeau was transferred to the care of the Sisters of Charity in New Orleans, where she remained until her death in 1891. According to records maintained by the Order, her mental state never fully recovered from whatever experiences she had endured at Willowbrook. She continued to speak of the plantation as if she was still residing there, and she maintained until her death that Constance's research had achieved remarkable success in areas that conventional science refused to acknowledge. The correspondence network revealed through Constance's letters was investigated by authorities in multiple states, but most of the addresses proved to be fictitious or led to individuals who denied any knowledge of research collaboration. The few medical professionals who acknowledged receipt of letters from Constance claimed that they had regarded her inquiries as the work of an amateur enthusiast and had provided only general information about theoretical concepts. Father Antoine's subsequent investigation into the spiritual aspects of events at Willowbrook resulted in a confidential report to the Bishop of New Orleans that was sealed in the diocesan archives. According to sources familiar with the document's contents, Father Antoine concluded that the activities conducted at the plantation represented a systematic attempt to undermine human free will through techniques that bordered on what he termed scientific possession. His recommendation that the property be consecrated and the buildings destroyed was not implemented, though the church did formally advise against any future residential use of the plantation. The property itself remained uninhabited following the investigation. Legal proceedings to settle Jeremiah Pemberton's estate were complicated by questions about Constance's legal status and the unclear circumstances of her disappearance. The plantation was eventually sold at public auction in 1876, but subsequent owners reported strange occurrences that led to rapid turnover of ownership throughout the remainder of the 19th century. Local residents continued to report unusual activity at Willowbrook well into the 1880s. Lights moving through the abandoned buildings, sounds of voices carrying across the fields during calm nights, and the persistence of chemical odors around the modified outbuildings were commonly mentioned in informal accounts preserved by parish oral historians. Several attempts to restore agricultural operations failed when workers refused to remain on the property after dark, citing feelings of being watched and hearing sounds that suggested the presence of multiple individuals in areas that appeared empty. The most detailed subsequent investigation of Willowbrook was conducted in 1887 by Dr. William Hartwell, a neurologist from Tulane University who had become interested in the case through his study of unusual psychological phenomena. Dr. Hartwell's findings, published in a limited circulation monograph in 1889, provided scientific analysis of the physical evidence that remained at the plantation 13 years after Constance's disappearance. Dr. Hartwell's investigation focused on the chemical residues found in the modified outbuildings and the systematic nature of the excavations discovered throughout the property. His chemical analysis revealed the presence of compounds that were consistent with experimental anesthetic agents and substances known to affect human perception and memory formation. More significantly, his measurements of the excavation sites revealed mathematical precision in their placement and dimensions that suggested knowledge of underground water systems and soil conditions that would have required extensive surveying and geological expertise. The neurologist's most troubling findings concerned what he termed environmental modifications throughout the plantation house and outbuildings. Systematic alterations to acoustics, lighting, and air circulation had been implemented with precision that suggested understanding of how environmental factors influence human psychology and behavior. Dr. Hartwell concluded that someone with advanced knowledge of human neurology and environmental psychology had designed the modifications specifically to create what he described as optimal conditions for behavioral manipulation. Dr. Hartwell's investigation also uncovered evidence that had been overlooked during the initial inquiry. Hidden compartments in the plantation office contained additional documentation that provided more complete insight into Constance's research methods and objectives. Among these materials were detailed maps of the local area marked with locations of isolated farmsteads, notes about the daily routines of neighboring families, and what appeared to be recruitment criteria for selecting individuals who would be suitable subjects for her experiments. The discovery of recruitment documentation raised disturbing questions about the scope of Constance's activities and the fate of individuals who might have been persuaded or coerced into participating in her research. Dr. Hartwell's analysis of missing person reports filed with various parish authorities between 1873 and 1874 revealed patterns that suggested several unexplained disappearances from the region around Willowbrook, though establishing direct connections proved impossible given the limited record-keeping practices of the era. Perhaps most unsettling was Dr. Hartwell's discovery of what appeared to be success documentation hidden within the plantation office walls. Detailed records describe subjects who had undergone what Constance termed consciousness restructuring and had achieved states that she characterized as optimal compliance and enhanced receptivity. These records suggested that her experiments had progressed far beyond theoretical research and had achieved results that she believed demonstrated the possibility of fundamentally altering human personality and behavior through systematic environmental and psychological manipulation. The question of what became of these allegedly successful subjects was never resolved. Dr. Hartwell's analysis suggested that Constance's research had reached a stage where she believed her techniques could create individuals who were psychologically incapable of independent action and would comply with any instruction without conscious resistance. If such subjects existed, their current whereabouts and condition remained completely unknown, though Dr. Hartwell noted several cases in Louisiana and neighboring states of individuals who had been found wandering with no memory of their identities or past experiences. The final documented investigation of Willowbrook Plantation occurred in 1923, when the property was purchased by the Louisiana Historical Society with the intention of preserving it as an example of antebellum architecture. However, systematic documentation of the buildings and grounds revealed evidence that someone had continued to use the plantation long after Constance's disappearance. Fresh excavations, recently modified structures, and chemical residues that matched those identified by Dr. Hartwell suggested that the research initiated in 1873 had continued under unknown direction for decades. The Historical Society's investigation was terminated after several researchers reported experiencing psychological distress while working at the plantation. These reports, archived in the Society's confidential files, described feelings of being observed, difficulty concentrating, and episodes of memory loss that occurred specifically while conducting work at Willowbrook. The Society concluded that the property presented unacceptable risks to research personnel and abandoned plans for historical preservation. In 1947, Willowbrook Plantation was destroyed by fire of unknown origin. Volunteer firefighters from the parish reported that the blaze burned with unusual intensity and produced smoke that carried chemical odors reminiscent of laboratory fires. The fire consumed not only the buildings, but also penetrated deep into the soil, apparently igniting chemical residues that had remained in the ground for over 70 years. After the fire, the excavation sites throughout the property were clearly visible as areas where the ground had burned differently, revealing the full extent of the systematic modifications that had been implemented during Constance's residency. The land where Willowbrook once stood remained vacant until 1961, when it was purchased by the state of Louisiana for incorporation into a wildlife preservation area. However, even this limited use proved problematic. Park rangers and wildlife researchers reported consistent equipment malfunctions, navigation difficulties, and psychological effects similar to those experienced by the Historical Society researchers. In 1968, the area was quietly reclassified as unsuitable for public access and was removed from all official park documentation. Today, the former site of Willowbrook Plantation exists in a legal and administrative limbo. No official records acknowledge its history, and maps of the area show only unmarked wetland. However, local residents continue to report strange phenomena associated with the location: vehicles that experience mechanical failures when passing nearby, electronic devices that malfunction in the vicinity, and persistent reports of lights and sounds that suggest ongoing activity in an area that has been officially vacant for decades. The case of Constance Pemberton and Willowbrook Plantation represents one of the most thoroughly documented, yet ultimately inexplicable events in Louisiana history. The evidence suggests systematic experimentation on human subjects using techniques that anticipated developments in psychological manipulation by several decades. Yet the fate of the experimenter, her subjects, and the ultimate results of her research remain completely unknown. Perhaps most disturbing is the evidence that the work initiated by Constance continued long after her disappearance, suggesting that her research had achieved a level of success that enabled its perpetuation without her direct involvement. The possibility that techniques for comprehensive behavioral control were developed at Willowbrook and subsequently deployed elsewhere represents a threat that extends far beyond the borders of La Fourche parish. The systematic nature of the cover-up that followed the initial investigation raises questions about the involvement of authorities at levels higher than local parish officials. The disappearance of records, the restriction of access to the property, and the consistent suppression of information about events at Willowbrook suggest that someone with considerable influence recognized the potential implications of Constance's research and took steps to ensure that it would never receive public scrutiny. The scientific community's complete silence regarding the documentation discovered at Willowbrook is perhaps the most telling evidence of the case's true significance. Research that was apparently decades ahead of its time, techniques that achieved results considered impossible by contemporary psychology, and evidence of systematic human experimentation should have generated extensive academic interest. The fact that no scientific institution has ever acknowledged the existence of this material suggests that its implications were understood and deliberately suppressed. In the end, the case of Willowbrook Plantation stands as a testament to the dangers of unchecked scientific ambition and the vulnerability of isolated communities to exploitation by those who possess knowledge and resources far beyond conventional limits. Whatever was accomplished in the fields and outbuildings of that remote Louisiana plantation between 1873 and 1874 represented a violation of human dignity that transcends the boundaries of conventional crime. The widow, Constance Pemberton, disappeared into history as completely as if she had never existed, but the evidence of her work remains buried in archives and sealed files across Louisiana and beyond. The subjects of her experiments, if they survived, may still walk among us, their identities erased and their minds reshaped according to specifications that died with their creator. And somewhere in the administrative shadows of state and federal bureaucracy, documents exist that would reveal the true scope of what was discovered at Willowbrook and why it could never be allowed to see daylight. The silence that has surrounded this case for over a century is perhaps its most eloquent testimony. In a world where information flows freely and historical events are endlessly analyzed and debated, the complete absence of public discussion about Willowbrook Plantation speaks to the existence of secrets so dangerous that they must be protected at all costs. The widow's legacy lives on not in academic papers or historical studies, but in the careful maintenance of ignorance about capabilities that should never have been developed and knowledge that should never have been acquired. And perhaps that silence itself is the most terrifying aspect of the entire case, the recognition that some discoveries are too dangerous for human knowledge, and some experiments should never have been conducted, regardless of their scientific merit or potential applications. The most recent development in the Willowbrook case occurred in 1969, when Dr. James Morton, a psychiatrist from Charity Hospital in New Orleans, published a brief paper in an obscure medical journal about what he termed inherited behavioral anomalies observed in certain Louisiana families. Dr. Morton's research, conducted without official sanction and published against the advice of his colleagues, documented patterns of psychological compliance and memory dysfunction that appeared to be transmitted across generations in families with historical connections to La Fourche parish. Dr. Morton's paper was quietly retracted within weeks of publication, and he was subsequently transferred to administrative duties that effectively ended his research career. However, Copies of his work had already circulated among researchers studying hereditary psychological conditions, and his findings raised disturbing questions about the long-term effects of whatever had occurred at Willowbrook Plantation nearly a century earlier. The families identified in Dr. Morton's research shared certain characteristics that defied conventional psychological explanation. Multiple generations displayed unusual compliance with authority figures, difficulty forming independent memories of significant events, and a tendency to accept contradictory information without questioning its validity. Most significantly, these families maintained oral traditions about ancestors who had worked with the widow, but could provide no details about the nature of this work or its duration. When interviewed by Dr. Morton, members of these families consistently reported gaps in their family histories corresponding to the 1870s and early 1880s. Attempts to trace genealogical records revealed systematic omissions and alterations in official documents that suggested deliberate efforts to obscure the connection between certain bloodlines and events at Willowbrook. The pattern was too consistent and too widespread to represent coincidental record-keeping failures. The implications of Dr. Morton's findings extended far beyond academic interest in hereditary psychology. If Constance Pemberton's research had indeed achieved the level of success suggested by the evidence, and if the effects of her techniques could be transmitted to subsequent generations, then the scope of the Willowbrook legacy encompassed not only her immediate subjects, but their descendants as well. Potentially, hundreds of individuals across Louisiana and neighboring states could be carrying the psychological modifications implemented during those crucial months at the plantation. The systematic suppression of information about Willowbrook, the consistent pattern of administrative interference with investigations, and the apparent coordination of efforts to prevent public awareness of the case all point to recognition at the highest levels of government that the widow's research had achieved results with profound implications for national security. The possibility that techniques for creating psychologically compliant populations had been developed and tested in rural Louisiana represented a threat to democratic institutions that could not be acknowledged or publicly addressed. Today, nearly 150 years after Constance Pemberton first arrived at Willowbrook Plantation, the case remains as mysterious and disturbing as ever. The physical evidence has been destroyed, the witnesses are long dead, and the official records have been systematically purged from accessible archives. Yet the legacy continues in forms that may be impossible to detect or measure using conventional methods. The families identified in Dr. Morton's suppressed research continue to live throughout Louisiana and the broader South, carrying genetic and psychological inheritances that they cannot understand or escape. The techniques developed by the widow may have been refined and deployed in other locations, creating additional populations of individuals whose thoughts and behaviors conform to specifications established over a century ago. And somewhere in the classified files of federal agencies, the true scope of what was accomplished at Willowbrook continues to influence policies and decisions that shape the lives of millions. The story of Willowbrook Plantation stands as a reminder that some knowledge comes at a cost too high for human civilization to bear. The widow Constance Pemberton may have unlocked secrets of human consciousness that should have remained forever hidden, and her legacy may continue to influence our world in ways that we cannot perceive or comprehend. In the end, perhaps the greatest horror is not what we know about Willowbrook, but what we can never know. How many minds were changed, how many lives were altered, and how many descendants continue to carry the invisible chains forged in the experimental chambers of a remote Louisiana plantation where science crossed boundaries that should never have been approached. The silence that surrounds this case is not merely the absence of information, It is the active maintenance of ignorance about capabilities that threaten the very foundation of human freedom. And in that silence, the widow's greatest achievement lives on, the creation of a truth so dangerous that it must be buried deeper than any grave, protected by walls of secrecy that may never be breached. The bayous of Louisiana keep their secrets well, but none more carefully than the truth about what really happened at Willowbrook Plantation during those months when a grieving widow decided that human consciousness itself was a problem to be solved through scientific method. Her solution may have been more successful than anyone dared imagine, and its consequences may still be shaping our world in ways we are no longer capable of recognizing.